Fresh snow blanketed the quiet suburban street, turning everything into a picture of winter serenity. The trees, the rooftops, even the sidewalks. Everything lay under a thick, glistening layer of white. It was beautiful, no doubt, but for some, it was also a challenge. James, a local gardener, stood by his small pickup truck, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. He had finished his morning shift at the community greenhouse and was about to head home when something caught his eye. Across the street, an elderly woman, Mrs. Dawson, was struggling to push her front door open against the weight of the snow piled up against it. He had seen her before, always alone, always quiet, a frail woman whose steps were careful and slow whenever she ventured outside. Without a second thought, James grabbed his shovel from the back of his truck and crossed the street. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached her house. "Let me help you with that," he called out, offering a warm smile. Mrs. Dawson looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "Oh dear, I didn't see you there. That's very kind of you," she said, stepping back inside to let him work. James got to shoveling, clearing the doorstep first, then working his way down the short walkway leading to the sidewalk. It wasn't easy. This was the heavy, wet kind of snow, but he didn't mind. He had spent years working with his hands, and physical labor was second nature to him. Every so often, he'd glance up at the window, catching Mrs. Dawson, watching him with a small, grateful smile. He didn't stop there. Seeing the driveway also buried under a foot of snow, he moved on to that, pushing through the cold, his breath coming out in visible puffs. It wasn't about money or recognition. He simply couldn't walk away knowing she'd have trouble getting out of her own home. By the time he finished, his arms ached, and his face was raw from the cold. He knocked on her door to let her know he was done. She opened it, her eyes welling up with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You didn't have to do all this." James brushed some snow off his sleeve and chuckled. "It's nothing really, just part of being a good neighbor." She reached for her purse, but James gently shook his head. "No need for that. Just stay warm, okay?" Mrs. Dawson blinked a few times, then nodded. "You remind me so much of my son," she murmured. James didn't pry. He simply wished her well and walked back to his truck, feeling good about the small gesture. He didn't know that his act of kindness would set off a chain of events he could never have expected. A few days later, James was back at work, pruning hedges and laying fresh soil for a client when he got a call. It was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Hello? Is this James?" a deep voice asked. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Daniel Dawson. You helped my mother the other day." James straightened, recognizing the last name instantly. "Oh, right. Yeah, I just cleared some snow for her. No big deal." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet chuckle. "No big deal to you, maybe, but to my mother, it meant the world." James smiled, but before he could respond, Daniel continued. "I'd like to meet you in person. There's something I want to give you." James furrowed his brows. "That's really not necessary. Please." Daniel interrupted, his voice sincere. "It's important." James hesitated. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about Daniel's tone made him agree. They set a time to meet at a local coffee shop the next day. As James hung up, a sense of curiosity settled over him. He had expected nothing in return for helping Mrs. Dawson, but now, it seemed, there was more to the story than he had realized. And whatever Daniel had in store for him, he had a feeling it was something he'd never forget. James arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early. He wasn't sure what to expect, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. He ordered a black coffee and took a seat by the window. Watching cars pass by on the slushy street, the sky was a dull grey, and the air smelled of melting snow and roasted beans from inside the shop. The bell above the door jingled, and James looked up. A tall man in his late 30s walked in, glancing around until his eyes landed on him. He had the same sharp features as Mrs. Dawson, but his expression was serious, almost unreadable. "James?" the man asked as he approached. James stood, offering a handshake. "Yeah, that's me. You must be Daniel." Daniel shook his hand firmly before sitting across from him. He set down a small paper bag and a cup of coffee. For a moment, neither of them spoke. James took a sip of his drink, waiting. "My mother told me what you did," Daniel finally said, his voice quieter now. "She called me that night, emotional, going on about how a stranger had shoveled her driveway without expecting anything in return." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You have no idea how much that meant to her." James shrugged. "I'm just glad she's okay." Daniel gave a small smile, but there was something else in his eyes. A weight, a hesitation. He glanced down at the bag on the table and slid it toward James. James raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Open it." James hesitated, but then unrolled the top of the bag and peeked inside. He pulled out a neatly wrapped package, feeling the weight of it before carefully unwrapping the brown paper. As soon as he saw what was inside, his breath caught. It was an old leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, edges frayed with age, but the initials, J.D., were embossed in gold on the front. "My father's journal," Daniel said, watching James closely. His name was Jonathan Dawson. James carefully turned the book over in his hands, unsure of what to say. "Why are you giving this to me?" Daniel leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Because my father was a gardener, just like you." James blinked, surprised. "He passed away when I was a kid," Daniel continued. "But my mother always kept his things. She said he had a passion for plants, for nature, for creating something beautiful out of nothing. When she saw you out there, shoveling her driveway, she told me it reminded her of him." He paused. "She thinks you were meant to have this." James felt a strange mix of emotions. Honor, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite name. He ran his fingers over the leather cover, feeling its history beneath his touch. "I can't take this," James said, shaking his head. "This belongs to your family." Daniel sighed. "I know it's unexpected, and maybe it doesn't make sense, but my mother believes things happen for a reason. She hasn't let go of this journal for decades, but she's convinced it was meant to find its way to you." He studied James for a moment before adding, "And to be honest, I think she's right." James swallowed, unsure of how to respond. He glanced back down at the journal, flipping it open carefully. The pages were filled with delicate handwriting, sketches of plants, and notes scribbled in the margins. It wasn't just a journal. It was a lifetime of passion, carefully preserved. As he turned another page, a small folded note slipped out. James caught it before it could hit the floor. He unfolded it, scanning the faded ink. It wasn't written in the same handwriting as the journal. It looked like Mrs. Dawson's. "If you are reading this, then I was right. Please, take care of it. You were meant to." James exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. This is a lot," he admitted, closing the journal. "I don't know what to say." Daniel nodded. "Take your time. Just know that my mother sees something in you. And honestly, after meeting you, I do too." James left the coffee shop that day, with the journal tucked under his arm, and a mind full of unanswered questions. He wasn't sure why this was happening, why fate had led him to Mrs. Dawson's doorstep that snowy day. But as he walked back to his truck, He had the strangest feeling that this was only the beginning. What he didn't know was that the deeper he looked into the journal, the more secrets he would uncover, secrets that would change everything. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, the old journal resting in front of him. He had flipped through some of the pages earlier, but now, under the warm glow of his kitchen light, he was ready to really dive in. He carefully opened it, turning the pages one by one, feeling as if he were stepping into another man's world. Jonathan Dawson had been more than just a gardener. He had been an artist in his own right. The pages were filled with meticulous sketches of flowers, trees, and intricate garden designs. Notes in the margins detailed soil conditions, weather patterns, and careful observations of nature. James found himself drawn in. His own love for gardening mirrored in the careful handwriting of a man he had never met. But then, near the middle of the book, something caught his eye. A loose sheet of paper tucked between the pages, as if someone had placed it there years ago and forgotten about it. He unfolded it, his heart beating a little faster. It was a letter, and it was addressed to Daniel. James frowned, scanning the faded ink. The date at the top was from over 30 years ago. "My dear son, if you ever find this, I want you to know how much I love you. I wanted to leave behind something for you, something that would remind you of who I was and what I cared about. I always dreamed we would share this passion together. But if life takes you down a different path, just know that no matter what, I am proud of you." James swallowed hard. This wasn't just a note. It was a father's final words to the son he never got to share his world with. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling the weight of it all. Had Daniel ever read this? Did he even know? It existed. The next morning, James wasted no time. He called Daniel and asked if they could meet again. They agreed to meet at Mrs. Dawson's house, where she was waiting with a warm smile and a cup of tea. James hesitated only for a second before pulling the letter from his pocket and handing it to Daniel. "I found this in the journal," he said, quietly. Daniel took it, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the fragile paper. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression shifted, first confusion, then something deeper. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edges of the letter. "I never saw this before," he murmured. His voice was rough, filled with emotion. He looked up at his mother, who was watching him with teary eyes. "Did you know about this?" Mrs. Dawson shook her head, pressing a hand to her chest. "No, my love, I never did." Daniel exhaled, running a hand over his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, he let out a soft, almost bitter chuckle. "He always wanted me to love gardening the way he did," he said. "But I never had the patience for it. I thought it was just his thing." James stayed quiet, letting him process. Daniel looked back down at the letter, then at the journal, running his fingers over its worn cover. "I spent years thinking I barely knew my father. And all this time, he left a part of himself behind." Mrs. Dawson reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "He loved you so much, Daniel. More than you ever knew." Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening, then turned to James. "I think my mother was right. You were meant to find this." He let out a breath. "And maybe I was meant to find it through you." For the first time since they met, James saw something shift in Daniel, something lighter, more open. In the weeks that followed, Daniel started visiting his mother more, and to James's surprise, he even asked for help planting a small garden in her backyard, something he had never shown interest in before. It was slow at first, just a few flowers and herbs, but James could see it wasn't about the plants. It was about reconnecting with his father, with his mother, and maybe even with himself. One evening, as James packed up his tools after helping with some planting, Daniel handed him back the journal. "You should keep this," Daniel said. James shook his head. "It belongs to your family," Daniel smiled. "I think my father would have wanted someone like you to have it. Besides," he glanced at the small patch of fresh soil, where a young tree now stood. "I think I'm finally starting to understand him in my own way." James looked at the journal, then at Daniel, and finally nodded. He wasn't just taking a book. He was carrying forward a story. As he left Mrs. Dawson's home that evening, he glanced back one last time, watching Daniel kneel by the new plants, gently patting down the soil. Somewhere, James liked to believe, Jonathan Dawson would have been proud.